There is a lot of talk about mental well-being and mental health, and today joining me is someone whom I've had the pleasure of knowing for some time. I've met him during the IPL, and he's someone who has worked in the sports industry as a sports psychologist. He's delved deep into the aspect of the mind, and very recently he's come out with this book, which I've had the pleasure of reading, called Breathe, Believe, Balance. And Shamal's journey is very interesting. He has lived as a monk. He has explored various areas of life, and he can give you a perspective about the human mind that very few can. And all in all, what makes this interesting is that he can link it to sport, and it makes it so easy and simple to understand the kind of techniques that he presents in the book with all those examples, and not just sport, but even other areas of life. So Shayamal Vallabhjee, thank you so much for joining Niche Sports. It's indeed a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks a lot, Nishad. I've been looking forward to this conversation. We bumped into each other, a chance to really peel away the layers behind psychology and sports science. So thank you for hosting me.
It really is fascinating, your journey and going through that book, getting all that together. How difficult or easy was it penning down years of experience into, say, 273 pages around? Yeah.
It wasn't easy. The book started off somewhere around 500, 600 pages, and I had to keep cutting it down because I wanted to create a memoir that was that encapsulated the three elements of my journey, which is sports science, spirituality, and psychology. But I wanted to make it very readable for everybody. I wanted to make it actionable. I wanted to peel away the science and really ground it down into a manner that anyone from a school child to a professor could read and really draw wisdom from it and grow and learn. And so that took me a lot of time. I worked with an editor of mine, a friend of mine in Los Angeles, who really constantly pushed me to re-edit. And that was a process on itself where I was writing and really keep changing the language so that it was more understandable. And it was a remarkable journey, but it took 14 months of writing to put that book together.
Wow, 14 months. And just what amazes me is the number of examples and the details, how simply you've been able to put it in the book. And one question that I wanted to ask you, since this is a sports program and you delve a lot into spirituality, how important is spirituality to sporting success? What is it that you have picked up along your sporting journey and your spiritual journey to link the two?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you link it towards sport, spirituality is in essence a cultivation of your higher self, right? But what spirituality teaches you is humility. Right. It teaches you to really ground your energy. And that's probably the most basic, most fundamental aspect of spirituality. And where this comes into sport is that as a sportsman, you walk onto a playing field really super confident, isn't it? Sometimes your confidence is so high, it's bordering on arrogance. And someone in that mental state is really not in a position to learn much. Because why? It's that arrogance that they need to perform. And when they step off that field, we need to really kill that arrogance, and we need to kill that ego, and we need to ground that energy. And I find that an athlete who has that spiritual grounding, I'm able to really ground his humility, which is really the bedrock of learning. And that's the integral role that spirituality plays in not just an athlete's life, but in anyone's life. A person who's spiritually grounded sees himself as a part of the whole, and he doesn't see himself as the center of the whole. And when you see yourself as a part of the whole, you're also humble enough to realize that I can learn from anyone and everyone. And you understand that my entire journey is a journey of impermanence. Whatever exists today may not exist tomorrow. My success today will be rewarded today, but it will not be rewarded tomorrow. The thing that brought me success today will not bring me success tomorrow. And it's that cultivation of that mindset that propels you towards having not just success, but having what I call a legacy. And there's a massive difference between this. There's a massive difference between having a legacy in sport and being successful in sport. In cricketing terms like we use, A person could go and score 50 in a T20 game, and that's a success. A person could score 100 in a test match, and that's a success. But to repeat that success for a decade is when you establish what's called a legacy in the sport, right? And humility is the foundation of a legacy. May not necessarily be the foundation for success, right? But success is short and sporadic. A legacy is long and continuous. And spirituality, that bedrock of humility, is the foundation of a legacy.
Shamal, it's quite interesting you say that it is, in a way, a grounding technique, or rather a grounding mechanism. Spirituality helps bring that humility. And we see that a lot of athletes do get affected by fame, the attention, being thrust into the spotlight after being unknown for years, when you're a beginner and learning your skill. So spiritualism or spirituality is definitely a way to deal with that fame and that hype and those expectations.
Absolutely, Nishad. Let me give you an example. And sports are a really cutthroat world. Because why? We are chasing a definition of success set by an external word or an external variable. That external variable is sometimes a ranking system. If you play tennis, you're trying to get to number 1. That's an external variable that's set. The person at number 20 is not saying that, I'm comfortable being where I am and I'm happy with staying here. He's chasing number 1. It's an external variable. The person trying to run is trying to run at a certain speed to break a record, which is an external variable. Everything is external. Now, when someone's chasing an external goal, right, the validation for that external goal is also external, which is fame, which is money, which is recognition. So in the world of sports, an athlete spends his adolescence and early on in life, when his mind is very susceptible, chasing an external goal and looking for an external reward. Now, when a person doesn't have spiritual grounding, what happens is that fame and that recognition can change them, because it molds their psyche to think that they are the most important person at that moment in time. But a person who is spiritually grounded is able to realize that, yes, I've worked hard to achieve this, but there are many variables beyond my control that have also contributed to that. That's humility. Understanding that there are other people around me that have helped me become successful. There are other variables. Sometimes it could be luck. Sometimes it could be in the right place at the right time. That is a byproduct of spirituality. Now, a person who is spiritually inclined does not become inundated by fame and recognition, right? They're able to keep it at a distance, and they're able to still cultivate that inner growth. A person who doesn't have that spiritual core is someone who fame changes you, right? Now, in the world, every single one of us wants to self-transcend. Self-transcend means we want to help our community, but it takes a special type of person to do that. It takes a person who is in tune with who they are to self-transcend. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, says an individual can only self-actualize through self-transcendence, which means by giving the best version of yourself to a community, you'll find who you are. But to make that leap, you have to have an acute understanding of who you are. And only a person who is humble enough to pause and reflect and realize that whatever I've achieved is 5% my effort and 95% the coming together of forces I cannot see and understand, right, will be able to self-transcend and then self-actualize. So this is a relationship between spirituality and managing fame. Now in India, we're very lucky. We're very lucky because we come from a deep, steeped spiritual culture, and we live in communities or we live in families where kids are living with their parents or their grandparents, right? So you still bring in some spiritual grounding through the ecosystem that we cultivated in. In the West, as soon as they get some sort of success, they're living alone. Now, when you're living alone, you remove an ecosystem that can ground your energy. So in India, our athletes, whilst they may not necessarily have a spiritual practice, like a meditation or a breath work or a religious practice, the mere fact that they're in an ecosystem of evolved, enlightened individuals living in a small family community, that community is grounding their energy through the rituals that they have practiced for decades. And that's a fundamental nuance that many athletes themselves don't even see.
And one of the interesting aspects that I liked about your book is you discuss forgiveness in a lot of detail. And this is a question that I ask my South African friends in particular, because you all have lived through the horrible times of apartheid. And then in 94, Nelson Mandela, he comes to power, and he's someone who has also inspired me. And he was someone who really preached forgiveness and practiced it. In fact, he also used the 95 Rugby World Cup, which I think is a fascinating story, to sort of use it to unite the country. So what is your view on forgiveness in sport, and in particular taking Mandela's example, who used an essentially Afrikaner sport to sort of unite a country, which for people on the outside is a very inspirational story?
Yeah, it's a beautifully inspirational story. Nelson Mandela understood right there and then that sport is probably one of the most unifying platforms on earth. I have friends, I don't even speak the same language as them. I don't even understand their culture, but it's a sport that unifies us. So Mandela knew right there and then that sport is the single most unifying factor that could bring a nation that has had so much of trauma and pain together. So he was a visionary in seeing that. He was also a visionary in knowing, and this was the guidance of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who told him, there is no future without forgiveness. Okay, so they understood acutely. And if you look back at South African political history, we had something that was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was based on the foundation of forgiveness. It was supposed to forgive a person for the atrocities that they committed in a pre-apartheid world, knowing that without forgiving, we have no chance of moving forward. Okay, so Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu found a platform through sport, right, to bring forth an energy like forgiveness to unify a nation. And we had a small window of opportunity. There's actually a scientific theory called the forgiveness window of opportunity, which shows that at the point of turning point, you have a minute window of opportunity, which could be days, weeks, hours, or months, depending on how big the crime is, right? For you to extend the olive branch. And if you don't extend the olive branch within that forgiveness window of opportunity, then what could have been energy moving forward quickly would turn into rage and revenge. Okay. And Mandela was very opportune in taking advantage of that forgiveness window of opportunity. And he had good counsel. Now we work, and this is a conversation about sports, so I'll try not to make it too political. But the South African freedom struggle was deeply supported by what was called the Indian National Congress at the time. And the Indian National Congress was built on the foundation of Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha principle of non-violence. Okay, so it was the Indian roots of non-violence, right, that supported Mandela's ideology of compassion and forgiveness, right, through sport, that created the cultural change that South Africa saw in the 1990s.
Oh, it is beautiful and phenomenal, isn't it? And you've later since then, been a part of various outfits, including the 2003 World Cup, where you were a part of the Indian contingent. And again, that's a fascinating campaign. Although 2011 was when India won the World Cup, a lot of people still say 2003 is possibly when the seeds were sown. And you could see how the team bounced back after the Australia defeat. What was it about that team that helped them bounce back, especially when fans were losing it back home in India? How did they manage to come back from the kind of pressure that they were facing? And it was all virtual pressure.
It was virtual pressure. It was a really, really testing time, because the truth was that, I was a very young man and I was experiencing this for the first time. It was very daunting for me to see what was happening. But we had a core team, and that team was really now or never, and that team that played in 2003 had spent the better part of 1.5 to 2 decades together, playing together. You're looking at the likes of Dravid, Javagal Srinath, Anil Kumble, Saurav Ganguly, Sachin Tendulkar. These guys who were the core of that team had spent 1.5 to 2 decades and he had a beautiful sprinkling of young energy through the Mahmud Case and the Zahir Khan and Ashish Nehras of the world, who brought in a different energy. So the theme was now and ever, and that was really what forged that energy forward, because they felt that for this team to really culminate 1.5 to 2 decades of unity together, it would be beautiful for them to win a World Cup together. And they realized that the only opportunity of them remaining as a unit together was that 2003, because straight after that, many people were going to go into retirement, and the chances of them even making the next World Cup in 2007 was slim. And that was what forged that energy. And the thing that really helped us move forward was, and I keep maintaining this, the success in the World Cup is a byproduct of experience. And experience lays the foundation for a win, but youth and exuberance drives it over the line. And that was the beautiful balance that India had in 2003. It had the stabilizing energy of the Kumbles and the Tendulkars and the Sehwags, but it had that exuberance of Yuvraj Singh and Zahir Khan and Ashish Nehra and Mahmud Kaif, who were really, invigorating energy onto that field. And it was that the duality between these two that creates the most beautiful energy for us to move forward. And there wasn't a single moment in that entire campaign where the team felt we were down and out. We never for once felt, we knew subconsciously Australia was a formidable force that we had to deal with. And probably in hindsight, I think that was probably the only force that we kind of doubted ourselves against in some stage. Whether it was in the prelim or whether it was in the final, we were always slightly uneasy when playing Australia, because Australia were a formidable team at that time. Everyone else, our energy was far higher. So, whether it was subconscious doubt that prevented us to play freely, whether it was they were a much better team, what it is much of a muchness. On the day, we were totally outplayed. The team, brought phenomenal energy to the table. They backed each other. They supported each other. Okay. But now in hindsight, I do think that, we lost to a team we may not have been fully confident we could beat. And that played on the manner in which each one played their own game.
And again, in the book, you give so many examples of, someone like a Jonty Rhodes, who was possibly at the fag end of his career, and you saw him putting his heart and soul into training regimes. The Indian team making an adjustment before facing Andrew Caddick and the other England bowlers at Durban. All these adjustments or these practices and the discipline in training. What has been your perspective, or what have been the other examples that you have seen where can you say that I remember someone telling me that if you've got discipline, you don't need motivation. So what is the kind of discipline and some of the other examples that you must have seen?
Well, that's not true. If you don't need, if you have discipline, you don't need motivation. Motivation is really when your goal is in sight. When the goal is fractionally in sight, it's easy to be motivated. It's hard to be motivated when the goal is out of sight. Now, discipline is doing the same thing repeatedly, right? So, for example, I could repeat the same skill over and over again, okay, and I will get better, but would I be motivated is a completely different thing, because motivation is linked to the destination. Discipline is linked to the process, okay? And what someone needs to learn is that, I often give the example, a marathoner is someone who runs a marathon. A runner is someone who runs every day. An author is someone who's published a book. A writer is someone who writes every day. Okay. And that's the difference between destination or motivation and a process or habit or discipline. A disciplined person is repeating the same thing over and over again. A motivated person gets to a destination and then stops there. Okay. So the fundamental question you got to ask yourself is, who am I aspiring to become? And what would that person do every single day? And then you repeat that every single day. Okay. And the cultivation of habits that need to lead to good discipline is very simple. If something feels good at that time, it feels pleasurable at that time, then inadvertently it's not going to lead you to a good place. If something feels difficult and tough at the time that you're doing it, it's going to lead you to a good place. So, for example, doing drugs, smoking, sleeping in late, all of those are pleasurable. There's nothing hard about doing any of those things. You stacked up over time, you got problems. Waking up morning, going for a run, going to the gym every day, eating your salads, meditating, those things when you're doing it are never easy and they never ever get easy. But those lead you to a great place. So if something is difficult at the moment you're executing it, it's going to lead you to a great place. If something is pleasurable at the moment you're doing it, it's going to lead you to a poor place. And that's the fundamental difference between understanding what you should be disciplined in relation to where you're trying to go.
It's really interesting you say that, because I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about a few champions that we've seen, especially in tennis. Someone like a Mahesh Bhupathi, you've seen him. What has made Mahesh Bhupathi different compared to other tennis players? Because he has definitely gone and achieved a lot more and has been an icon for the sport in India.
Yeah, Mahesh, I spent the better part of 7-8 years working with him. And, he's a phenomenally talented person. And Mahesh was acutely aware of what his strengths were, and he trained to bring his strength out and leverage it. He, at the time when I was working with him, had undoubtedly one of the best cross-court returns in the game. Backhand cross-court returns. No one could touch it. You'd struggle to even return that ball. Okay. And he knew that, and he set up his entire game to that. But fundamentally, he's a highly disciplined person. In the 7.5, 8 years, I think that we were together, I can't even remember how many days he took off. To give you an example, I was the best man at his wedding, and we played a tournament and we flew in for his wedding on the Friday, and he was getting married on Saturday or Sunday morning. And Sunday afternoon after the wedding, he took his wife Lara and he flew to the next tournament in Dubai.
Already, wow.
The same afternoon, exactly. So I don't know too many people who would do that, and some people will call him crazy, but he was a highly focused individual, highly confident individual, trained supremely hard. He was very meticulous with what he ate. We worked in an era when I didn't even have too much of technologies available to optimize his performance. Sometimes I look back at the athletes I worked with. I look back at the Jonty Rhodes and the Sean Pollocks. I look back at, the Hashim Amlas and Sanias and Mahesh's, for example. And I wish I was working with them at their prime now, where I have the available technologies I have to optimize a person's performance, to optimize their body and mind. And just look at what possibly could have happened.
It's amazing. You give that example of his commitment, how he traveled the next day after his wedding to another tournament. And the other person whom you just mentioned, I wanted to ask you about, is Sania Mirza, who I feel has done so much for Indian tennis with her achievements. And I think one of her biggest moments, possibly one of the best things she did, was after maternity to come back and to perform at a high level. I think that was really a true mark of a champion. So again, a similar question for Sania. In a country where there weren't many women's tennis players who had reached that far, what made her click and sustain it over a long period of time, even after maternity?
I'm asked this question almost weekly, where who's the one athlete who you've worked with, who you probably think is the best role model, is someone who you really look up to and stuff like that. And I've been giving this answer consistently for a very long time. And I worked with some of the best marathon runners in the world and cricketers and everything. And that answer has always been Sania Mirza.
Oh, wow.
The reason I say this is because it's not just what she's achieved. It's not just 6 Grand Slams. She was a female tennis player coming out of India at a time when the male tennis players weren't even getting support, leave alone the female tennis players. Okay. She was a young Muslim girl right, who had to wear a certain type of apparel, right, to perform.
Mm.
So she was inundated by that pressures. Okay. She was dealing with pressures most people would just capitulate under. Right. And when I look at all my athletes, my male athletes really only have to worry about the pressures of performance or pressures that they have brought onto themselves, like, for example, unhealthy relationships or unhealthy marriages. But Sania was dealing with things she never asked for. She was dealing with external pressures thrown at her by anybody at any particular time, and she dealt with it with courage. She dealt with it with conviction. She never let it derail her from what was needed to perform. She always was remarkable in how she shone and how she portrayed herself, her ethics, her values. And for these reasons, she's undoubtedly one of the best athletes I've ever worked with.
Shamal, that is some interesting insight into Sania Mirza and what she has achieved. And definitely she was up against it a lot more than some of India's male athletes. And that brings me to the next question, which is, now you spoke about individuals, how they manage themselves, Mahesh Bhupathi and Sania Mirza, although they've found a lot of success in doubles. They did start off playing tennis individually, but how much does individual spirituality or individual growth contribute to the overall picture for a team's success? For every individual is important to the team, and it's a team sport, say like a cricket or a football. So to have an evolved athlete mentally, collectively, how do you look at it?
Oh yeah, it plays a fantastic stabilizing impact on the rest of the team. You're able to ground your energy, you're able to perceive options as opposed to react, you're able to keep your emotions at check. So it plays a fundamentally very, very vital force in how it stabilizes the energy of the team. Also, someone who is spiritually evolved or grounded in some shape and form is not always trying to push their agenda, isn't it? So they become a beautiful mediator in locker room discussions where they're able to facilitate different perspectives, because that person is aware that the current perspective is a version of reality and not necessary reality. They're also aware that two opposing forces can coexist. So when you realize that two opposing forces could coexist, that means that two people could say something completely opposite and both of them could be right. It's only a spiritually evolved person that will be able to understand that. And having someone like that in your ecosystem is very, very important.
And when you talk about individual performances, individual success, sometimes the power of expectations can get to a sports person. And you've spoken about how spirituality humbles them or can ground them, but there is an expectation, or rather a feeling that a sportsman has to have this aura of invincibility. Like a great player in a country like India in particular cannot show vulnerability. How does a sports person deal with that, where they are expected to be these tough people? At the same time, they are human, they'll have their vulnerabilities, but they can't express it. How does a sports person deal with that?
It's not that they can't express their vulnerability. The fundamental question is, are you prepared to deal with the consequences of your vulnerability? And that is what they don't have clarity with. No one's saying you can't be honest, and no one's saying you can't be vulnerable. The point is that your vulnerability comes at a price, and are you prepared to pay that price? Now, your stardom came with a price, and you wanted that price. The stardom came with the price of bigger endorsements, more people knowing you, all of those things, and you were happy to do that. So we also understand that we all are flawed. So we have mistakes, we make mistakes, and we make errors. And sometimes those errors of judgment are things that really catapult us to move forward and learn and grow. Okay. And you have to accept that and understand that. To the athlete who is fear of being vulnerable, my advice to you is your fear of being vulnerable is the biggest stumbling block to your growth. Because the longer you hide away from something that's painful, the more you hide away from pain, and pain is really what will propel you forward towards growing. It's only when you have skin in the game in something that you're really going to make a vested interest towards changing a behavior pattern. If you've made an error and you've not felt the consequences of that error, then what skin in the game do you have to create a change that moves you to make sure you never repeat that error again? So people who are scared of vulnerability are programming their psyche in a very dangerous manner. They're programming their psyche thinking that they're invincible, which is false. You're not invincible at all. You have many errors. You're fundamentally aware of these errors. You're just being deceitful to yourself, and deceit is going to fundamentally lead you down the wrong path. So that is a problem. So nobody's telling you can't be vulnerable. That's a perception of reality. It's not reality, and courage is about being vulnerable and facing the consequences of your vulnerability. Okay, so yes, an athlete in India has the choice, and they all exercise that choice every single day, right? And you must understand that a pain pushed away deep into your subconscious mind will fester into a level of toxicity that's sabotaging various things in your life. It could be your health, your happiness, your wealth, your performance, whatever. And if you do not consciously address it, it will subconsciously manifest in a narrative that you are unaware of or not prepared to address at a time when you don't want to. So that is a choice that you will be faced with at that time.
There's one part that I've marked, and I wanted to ask you about this because it's used a lot in sport. And on page 110 and 111, you speak about getting in the zone, and there is a definition by Steve Kotler from his book Rise of Superman, where you talk about that flow, that effortless flow, where he says every action, every decision leads effortlessly, fluidly, seamlessly to the next. It's high-speed problem solving. It's being swept away by the river of ultimate performance. And you say in the sporting context, people talk about getting in the zone. There was one anecdote of a batsman who scored 100 and came back to the dressing room, and the captain asked him which of the shots you played was your most favorite, and he said, I don't remember it. He was in that state of flow. How do you define getting in the zone in terms of sport, and how much does the subconscious mind take over when an athlete is in that zone?
The state of flow is driven purely by the subconscious mind. The actions are happening subconsciously, and subconscious is a byproduct of automation. So how do you get into a state of zone? Very simple. You got to physiologically practice harder than you would compete, right? So, you got to push yourself to the limits in practice every single day, because when you physiologically tapped out, the first faculty that's compromised is your cognitive faculty. And being in a state of flow is driven by your cognition. Okay, so the first way to get into a state of flow is practice exceptionally hard every single day. The second thing is perfect practice. You want to start automating skills, because the more cognitive faculties are going into processes, the less mind space you have to process options at that time. The harder athletes practice, the more skill transference happens from the conscious to the subconscious mind, and that is called automation. So the more something is automated, the more cognitive space you have to understand responses and process the best response at a highly fast time. And that is what the state of flow is. The state of flow is a byproduct of physiologically pushing yourself beyond the limits every day, but it's also the byproduct of perfect practice that's transferring a skill from conscious to subconscious mind by what we call automation.
Perfect. And Shayamal, finally, I wanted to ask you this question because you've lived for some time as a monk, and it's obviously it's not as easy as people may think. In fact, it's very hard. But when you came back after that experience, how much did it change your approach to sport, living as a monk? I know it changed your approach to a lot of areas in life, but getting back to the sports field and doing what you used to do, how much did that change?
It changed everything, because before I went to the temple, I used to get very disturbed by the pressure of the game. I was always looking at millions of data points. I was studying GPS, I was studying body physiology, pathology, doing a whole host of tests. And I'm not saying that those tests are not important, but after coming back from the monk, I was able to really still my mind to ask, what's the most important thing that I need to change? And is changing somebody's physiology or making them run faster going to make them more successful? What is the thing that's going to contribute the most to success? It taught me to really focus inward as opposed to focusing outward. Before the temple, I focused only externally. I looked at everything outside. I looked at technology. I looked at bats. I looked at bat speed. I looked at injuries. I looked at GPS data, the number of turns, the number of accelerations, the number of decelerations. We looked at gut microbiome, genetics, food intolerances, you name it. Everything under the sun I looked at, except looking inside. And after I came out from the temple, I looked only inside. I realized that what is the difference between reality and a perception of reality? Is a certain percentage or a certain component of your psyche is the difference, is in the perception. What is driving my perception? You understand? So I looked at all of that. So I looked at, I'm measuring something externally, but what I'm not measuring is the component in the psyche that's driving the work ethic that would shift that variable. And that's what I needed to do. So I spent all my time started looking inward because that's in my control.
It's beautiful. And Shayamal, it has been such a pleasure to chat with you. I've learned a lot today with this discussion. Definitely learned a lot reading your book. And thank you so much for sharing all these insights. I hope it will help a lot of people out there. Definitely, it has helped me. And thank you so much once again for joining us. I hope you had a good time answering my questions.
Yeah, it was a great experience. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And everyone, we'll be back on Niche Sports very soon. I hope you've had a good one. Stay home, stay safe.